A single whisper pierced the night, carrying more weight than a siren or gunshot. From that moment forward, nothing was ordinary, because the one who should have been invisible became the one no one could ignore. The path from that whisper to the final truth is filled with danger and discovery, ending in a twist that will not leave your mind. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your thoughts on the story and the place you're watching from. I want to hear your voice. Officer Clara Whitmore had always been told that the night shift would test her in ways that no training academy could prepare her for, but she had not yet experienced the kind of night that would bend her instincts and force her to confront the uncomfortable truth about trust, prejudice, and survival. The city was washed in steady rain, the streets glistening with a mirror-like sheen that reflected fractured colors from neon signs and rusted street lamps. Clara, a young white police officer still adjusting to the rhythms of working alone in the Southern District, guided her cruiser through the dimly lit roads with cautious eyes. Her tires sliced through shallow puddles, the sound muffled by the relentless patter of water. She parked near a block of decaying warehouses, a part of town where sirens blended into the background and forgotten lives lingered in the shadows. She pushed open the door of the car, boots splashing as she stepped into the cold drizzle, tightening her hood and pulling her jacket closer. It was then that she heard the voice, gravelly, strained, almost like the storm itself was trying to speak to her. "Don't talk, just listen." The words froze her in place. Her training screamed at her to scan the area, to raise her hand toward the holster of her firearm, to challenge the voice with authority. Instead, she found herself turning slowly toward the source, her pulse suddenly sharp in her veins. A man stood against the brick wall, rain streaking down his worn clothes, his dark skin half hidden beneath a tangled mess of hair. His beard was unkempt, his hands dirtied by street life, yet his eyes deep, piercing, filled with something fierce cut through the night with urgency. Beside him, a muscular pit bull with scars across its muzzle stood rigid, its body tense, ears pointed, gaze fixed unwaveringly on the alley behind her. Clara's stomach tightened. Every alarm bell in her body told her she was exposed, that someone or something was behind her, waiting. She shifted her stance, pressing her back against the car, unsure whether to draw her weapon or demand answers. She studied the man for any hint of instability, expecting the slur of a drunk or the erratic sway of someone high, but instead she found precision in his posture and clarity in his words. His voice, though hoarse, carried the weight of certainty. "He's been waiting there," he whispered, trembling lips barely moving. "Watched you drive up. I saw him follow you." Her breath caught, and she felt her hand flex on her weapon. The rain blurred the edges of her vision, masking the subtle noises of the night, but she swore she could feel eyes watching her from the dark slit of the alley. The dog growled, low and guttural, hackles rising like quills, as if affirming the warning. Clara called sharply, her voice bouncing off the slick bricks. "Who's there?" The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the heavy rain. But then she heard it, a shuffle, light but unmistakable, the sound of a shoe sliding on wet pavement. Her flashlight snapped on with practiced speed, slicing through the storm in a thin blade of light. She swept it across the alley's edge, the beam bouncing off the dented trash cans and pools of water. For a moment, nothing seemed there. Then, in a sudden flash of motion, a figure bolted forward, sprinting toward her with reckless speed. Adrenaline roared in Clara's chest. She reached for her gun, but the ragged man's voice cut through the chaos once again, sharper, more desperate. "Behind you, with a knife." In that instant, Clara felt her entire world tilt. Her badge and training urged her to trust only herself, to rely on the procedures drilled into her for moments of life and death. But here she was, caught between the shadows of an unseen threat and the fierce urgency of a black man society had discarded, a man who by all outward appearances should have been invisible. Yet he was the one pulling her back from the edge of disaster. She thought of how her fellow officers might dismiss his words, how society had written him off as worthless, dangerous even, but his tone carried a gravity that demanded she believe him. She pivoted quickly, flashlight beam cutting across the rain, and braced herself for what was about to unfold. The world seemed to narrow to the space between the shadows and her pounding heart. Her senses sharpened, every nerve screaming that danger was inches away, and still her thoughts flickered to the man against the wall, to his scarred dog, to the idea that her survival might depend not on her badge or her weapon but on the instincts of someone everyone else ignored. The weight of that realization pressed down on her more heavily than the rain itself. She was at the threshold of something unexpected, something that would ripple far beyond a single night of duty. She couldn't yet see the whole story, but she could feel the shift in the air, the way fate had turned its gaze toward her and toward the man who had chosen to speak when silence would have been safer. The rain poured harder as Clara braced herself against the cruiser, her flashlight beam cutting across the slick alleyway in jagged slices of white light, her heart pounding with such force she could feel it in her throat, and her hand tightening on the grip of her gun though she had not yet drawn it, still caught in that razor edge of hesitation between instinct and caution. The homeless black man, Langston Pryor, did not move from his place against the wall, his pit bull king growling low with a fury that seemed to come from some primal knowledge of what lingered in the shadows, and Clara's mind flashed with the memory of his voice, hoarse and urgent, warning her that someone had followed her, that danger waited not in vague possibility, but in real flesh and blood only feet away. Suddenly, a blur of motion exploded from the alley, a man's form breaking from the blackness like a specter, sprinting toward her with reckless speed, water splashing beneath his heavy boots, his breath audible even over the storm. The glint of steel caught her eye for an instant as lightning illuminated the street, the unmistakable outline of a knife raised high in his hand, and Clara's instincts finally screamed with clarity. She was under attack. Her hand snapped her weapon from its holster, but before she could raise it, Langston's voice cut through the chaos once more, a ragged shout of warning that seemed to slice the night itself. "Don't shoot! He's got a knife!" The attacker lunged with ferocity, his blade arcing downward in a blur of silver, and Clara sidestepped desperately, her boots slipping slightly on the soaked pavement, her body slamming back against the cruiser with a dull thud. The pit bull surged forward with a snarl, teeth bared, forcing the attacker to hesitate for a fraction of a second, and that pause was enough for Langston to act. Without thought for himself, he hurled his body forward, slamming into the knife-wielding man with the sheer weight of survival carved into his muscles, both of them crashing into the puddles with a violent splash that sent water flying. Clara raised her gun, her breath sharp, but her sightline blurred as the two men grappled on the ground, limbs twisting, shadows shifting, the blade flashing dangerously close to both of their faces. Her training told her to fire, to end the threat with one pull of the trigger, but her instincts screamed that the margin of error was too thin, that one wrong shot could kill the man who had just risked everything to warn her. The rain hammered against her hood, her vision streaked with droplets, but she moved quickly, circling the fight, trying to find an angle, her pulse roaring like thunder in her ears. Langston's grunts filled the night, raw and determined, as he forced the attacker's arm back, the blade trembling inches from his skin. The dog barked furiously, snapping at the assailant's legs, each bite buying precious seconds of survival. Clara's fingers tightened on the trigger, every nerve screaming for resolution, but she stopped herself and raised her weapon skyward, firing a warning shot into the air. The crack split the storm, a deafening punctuation that rattled the buildings around them and startled the attacker long enough for Langston to wrench the knife free from his grip and hurl it across the pavement, where it skittered to a stop near Clara's boots. She kicked it hard, sending it clattering into the gutter out of reach, and rushed forward, snapping her cuffs from her belt. The attacker thrashed violently, spitting curses, but Clara and Langston together forced him down, her knee pinning his arm while she clamped the cold steel tight around his wrists, the sound of the lock clicking echoing louder than the storm itself. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze, the rain still pouring, the street empty save for the three of them, the knife disarmed, the cuffs locked, and Clara trembling with the knowledge of how close death had brushed against her. She holstered her gun slowly, her eyes flicking toward Langston, who collapsed back onto the wet pavement, his chest heaving with exhaustion, his hair plastered to his forehead, his hands muddy but steady. King sat loyally at his side once more, tail wagging faintly as if proud of his master's defiance against the darkness. Clara stared at him, her throat tight, realizing in that moment that her life had not been preserved by the Academy's lessons or by the badge pinned to her chest, but by a man the city had cast away, a man whose skin, scars, and circumstance made him invisible to most, yet whose courage had burned brighter than any uniform around her. She bent slightly, her voice softer than she intended. "You could have been killed." The rain still poured in relentless sheets as Clara stood over the subdued attacker. Her cuffs locked and the weapon kicked far out of reach, but her focus kept sliding back to the man who had thrown himself into danger without hesitation, the homeless black man who had warned her and saved her life when hesitation might have cost her everything. And as she holstered her sidearm with hands that still trembled from the adrenaline, she found herself staring at Langston Pryor with a mix of disbelief and awe. His chest rose and fell in uneven bursts, the exhaustion evident in every breath, his soaked clothes clinging to a frame hardened not by comfort but by survival, and yet his eyes remained steady, sharp, cutting through the storm with the quiet composure of someone who had nothing left to fear. King, his pit bull, pressed close against him, tail thumping faintly even as the dog's body remained taut with lingering tension, protective and loyal in ways Clara rarely saw even in trained canine units. And for a brief moment she marveled at the bond between man and animal, forged not in training academies or controlled drills, but in the brutal test of street survival. Backup arrived minutes later, red and blue lights flashing wildly through the rain as squad cars screeched to a halt, officers spilling into the scene with weapons drawn and questions barking into the night. But Clara raised a hand firmly, her expression commanding silence before the inevitable dismissals could fall from their lips. "He did it," she said, pointing toward Langston, her voice louder than she intended, but laced with a conviction that left no room for doubt. He stopped the attacker. The silence that followed was thick. Disbelief etched across the faces of her colleagues as they turned their gazes on Langston, who shifted uncomfortably under the weight of their stares, his head dropping slightly as though bracing for ridicule instead of praise. And Clara's chest tightened with anger at the thought of how easily they might write him off. She saw the flicker of doubt in their eyes, the unspoken prejudice that measured worth in uniforms and clean clothes, and she knew this was one of those moments where truth and perception would collide, and where she had the power to decide which one survived. The suspect was dragged off into the back of a cruiser, his curses muffled by the storm, and the scene began to disperse, but Clara lingered, crouching beside Langston as he leaned back against the wall with King curled at his side, his eyes darting between her and the wet pavement. "You should go to the hospital," she urged, her voice quieter now, but he shook his head immediately, his refusal sharp, laced with something more than stubbornness, something like fear or shame, as though the sterile lights of a hospital ward held dangers she could not see. "No hospitals," he rasped, his tone final, and Clara recognized the wall in his voice, a wall built from years of being dismissed, ignored, perhaps mistreated, a wall she knew she could not break in one night, no matter how badly she wanted to. Instead, she went to her patrol car, retrieving a blanket from the trunk and returning to drape it gently over his soaked shoulders, the gesture simple but heavy with meaning, and he accepted it silently, his gaze softening just a fraction as King pressed closer for warmth. For the first time, Clara let herself see past the ragged clothes, past the dirt and the scars, to the man beneath, and she wondered what story had led him here, what loss or tragedy had carved such resilience into his frame, what choices or cruelties of fate had left him standing in the rain with only a dog for family. She wanted to ask, but she held her tongue, knowing some questions could not be forced, not now, not when the night still carried the echoes of violence. "Thank you," she said instead, the words heavier than she expected, weighted with sincerity she rarely revealed on duty, and she watched as he studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable before he finally nodded, a faint shadow of a smile tugging at his lips as King licked his hand, breaking the tension with a gesture of pure loyalty. For Clara, the realization landed with crushing clarity. She had been saved not by protocol or equipment, not by backup or training, but by the humanity of someone the world had long ago discarded, someone whom others might see as worthless, but who had proven more heroic than anyone in uniform that night. The lesson pressed into her chest like the rain, heavy and undeniable, and as she stood and radioed in the conclusion of the call, she promised herself silently that this would not be the last time she saw him, that she would not allow Langston Pryor to disappear back into the shadows of a city too blind to notice the heroes in its midst. The following days weighed on Clara Whitmore with a heaviness she could not shake, her mind replaying the violent encounter in the rain over and over again, the knife flashing in the dim light, the sound of her warning shot exploding into the night, and the image of Langston Pryor, a homeless black man wrapped in a patrol blanket, fading back into the shadows with his dog King at his side. refusing the hospital and resisting the idea of help as though accepting assistance would be more dangerous than facing the streets alone, and though her shift returned to routine calls, disturbances, traffic stops, and paperwork that seemed endless, she found her thoughts circling back to him as if the city itself were haunted by his presence. She drove the same streets hoping for another glimpse, checking alleys between calls, even visiting shelters where she asked quietly about a tall black man with a scarred pit bull. But the answers were always the same: vague nods and shrugs, stories of someone who came and went, never staying long enough to be known, a ghost who belonged everywhere and nowhere. Clara felt the frustration rising inside her, not simply because she wanted to thank him again, but because she needed to understand him, needed to reconcile how someone written off as worthless by society could act with more courage and selflessness than men and women she wore the uniform beside. A week passed before fate put them in the same place again, and she almost didn't notice him at first, sitting beneath the overhang of a boarded-up grocery store, King curled loyally against his legs, both of them shivering in the late autumn chill. But when she slowed her cruiser and stepped out into the drizzle, he lifted his head and gave her a look that was calm, almost resigned, as if he had expected her to find him eventually. "Thought you forgot," he rasped, his voice carrying the same hoarseness she remembered from that night, and Clara shook her head, kneeling down so she could meet his eyes directly. "Not a chance," she said simply, offering him a sandwich and bottled water from the bag she had packed deliberately that morning, a habit she had developed since the encounter, carrying food in her trunk not just for long shifts, but in the hope she would see him again. He accepted silently, tearing off a piece of bread to feed King before taking a bite himself, and for the first time Clara saw something soften in his eyes, a trace of trust cracking through the hardened layers of suspicion and survival that surrounded him. She sat with him on the curb despite the curious glances of pedestrians, ignoring the tug of protocol that told her she shouldn't fraternize off-duty with civilians, much less one the department would dismiss as irrelevant, and after a long silence, she asked quietly, "Why'd you do it that night? Why risk yourself for me?" Langston didn't answer right away, scratching behind King's ear while staring at the pavement as though the cracks in the concrete told a story only he could read. And finally he said, "Because no one else would. And because you didn't look at me like trash when you saw me." His words struck Clara with more force than the storm ever had, cutting through her assumptions and exposing how often people like him were dismissed as invisible, as burdens, as less than human. And she realized that for Langston, that single moment of being acknowledged as a man rather than a nuisance had been enough reason to risk his life. Over the following weeks, Clara found herself drawn to his presence, creating excuses to pass the same blocks, leaving food or blankets when he wasn't there, learning the pattern of his wandering until she could anticipate where he might rest, and slowly pieces of his story began to surface. He told her in fragments, never in long monologues, just scattered confessions like embers falling from a fire. Once he had a steady job at a factory. Once he rented a small apartment with a window that caught the morning light. Once he had a wife who loved him, but who died in an accident that shattered his world. Once he tried to recover, but medical bills and grief drove him into debt until the walls of his life caved in completely, leaving him on the streets with only King to anchor him. Clara listened, never pushing, never demanding, letting him speak in his own time, and the more she heard, the more she understood that Langston Pryor was not a man defined by his homelessness, but a man broken by a society that abandoned him once he no longer fit its mold. She saw his intelligence in the way he quoted bits of literature under his breath, his knowledge in how he spoke of history with a sharpness many of her colleagues lacked, and his compassion in the way he shared every scrap of food with King before taking a bite for himself. Slowly, Clara's respect deepened into something heavier, a conviction that this man had more to offer the world than the world was willing to admit. And each time she left his side, she carried that conviction back to the precinct like a secret no one else would understand. Yet she also saw his reluctance, the way he resisted every suggestion of shelter programs or rehabilitation services, muttering, "I'm fine out here," with a bitterness that revealed the lie. And she recognized the exhaustion in his bones, the longing in his eyes when families passed by, or when the smell of food drifted from warm cafes he could not enter. The bond between Clara and Langston grew in small, fragile steps, the kind forged not by convenience but by repeated choices to show up for each other even when the world expected nothing from them. And though Clara told herself she was simply repaying a debt, She knew in her heart that it had become something deeper, a pull she could not ignore, for each time she left food or blankets, or simply her presence beside him on the curb, the memory of his warning voice and the scarred dog by his side wrapped itself tighter into her life. She had begun to notice him in the quiet spaces of her routine, seeing his face in the reflection of her cruiser window, hearing his rasp in the silence after a call, feeling the weight of his unspoken truths in the way her colleagues dismissed the nameless homeless who drifted through their reports as faceless statistics. She hated their casual jokes, their hardened detachment, and though she did not always speak up, she carried the anger inside her, knowing that the man who had saved her would be invisible to them if they crossed him in daylight. Then came the night that tested the fragile trust they had built, a night that reminded Clara just how vulnerable he remained in a city that mocked weakness. She was driving a late patrol when the call came through the radio, a disturbance reported near an abandoned warehouse in the industrial quarter, a place often crawling with gangs and drifters, and as she pulled into the lot, her headlights swept across a scene that made her stomach twist. Langston was there, his back pressed against the graffiti-streaked wall, a circle of white gang members taunting him with cruel laughter, their voices raised above the pounding rain, mocking his ragged clothes, his skin, and worst of all, threatening to take King from him as though the dog were a prize to be stolen. Clara's training urged her to announce her presence with authority, but her heart surged with something hotter, more personal, as she flung open the door and shouted, "Police, drop it!" The gang sneered at her, their bravado thick with the arrogance of men who thought the world would never hold them accountable. But the sight of her badge and the roar of approaching backup sirens broke their courage, sending them scattering into the shadows with curses tossed over their shoulders. Clara rushed to Langston, her boots pounding through puddles, her breath catching as she saw the bruises already forming on his cheek, the cuts on his hands, and the way he clutched King's leash as if holding on to the last anchor of his world. She knelt beside him, pulling the small first aid kit from her belt, dabbing at the blood with shaking hands, and for once he did not resist her help, though his eyes flickered with shame, as though being seen in such vulnerability wounded him deeper than any fist. "You don't owe me this," he muttered, his voice low, but Clara shook her head firmly, her hands steady as she cleaned the cut above his brow. "You saved me first," she replied, the truth undeniable, and the words seemed to hang in the air between them heavier than the storm, forcing him to swallow back whatever protest he had been ready to give. For the first time, he allowed someone to tend to his wounds without pulling away, without building a wall of sarcasm or silence, and in that moment Clara felt the shift, the fragile but undeniable deepening of trust that could not be bought or demanded, only earned through pain shared and courage remembered. When she finished, she sat back against the wall beside him, the two of them soaked to the bone, the rain turning the warehouse lot into a river of broken reflections, and she realized just how rare it was for her to feel safe simply sitting next to someone, not because of a uniform or a weapon, but because of the unspoken bond forged in nights like these. Langston leaned his head back against the bricks, eyes closing briefly as King curled at his feet, the dog's tail thumping softly against the ground in quiet relief, and Clara let herself breathe, let herself feel the strange comfort of his presence. He had been cornered, beaten, mocked, yet he had not surrendered, and though his pride stung at being rescued by her, she saw in his silence a recognition that he was no longer alone. For Clara, the realization burned bright. She was no longer simply protecting a civilian or honoring a debt. She was standing beside a man who had become important to her in ways that went beyond duty, beyond gratitude, beyond the rigid lines the world tried to draw between them. The bond forged in the warehouse lot lingered between Clara and Langston like a quiet flame that refused to be extinguished, and though days passed with Clara back on her routine patrols, answering calls that blurred together in their monotony, her mind returned again and again to the bruises on his face, the way his eyes had flickered with shame when she helped him, and the subtle shift in his guard when he finally allowed her presence without pushing her away, and she realized that she had crossed a threshold she could not reverse. No longer able to see him as just another face on the street, but as a man whose courage and vulnerability mattered deeply to her. That truth came into sharper focus the night the call went out about a missing child, a frantic radio dispatch cutting through the air with a panic that electrified every officer within earshot. For the disappearance of a young boy in the park after dusk was the kind of nightmare that drew the city's full attention. Clara raced toward the scene, lights flashing, her cruiser skidding to a halt on the slick grass where terrified parents sobbed near an empty swing set, their voices breaking as they pleaded for someone to find their son, and officers spread out in teams, flashlights sweeping through bushes and tree lines, their shouts echoing into the darkness. Hours slipped away with no sign of the boy, and the heavy dread settled over the search like a suffocating blanket, every passing minute lowering the chances of a safe recovery. Clara's chest ached as she pushed deeper into the park, her flashlight beam dancing over shadows, when a voice rose suddenly behind her, rough yet familiar. "He's in there," Langston said, pointing toward a locked maintenance shed on the far edge of the park, King straining at the leash with his nose pressed to the door, barking with a determination that left no doubt he had found something. Clara froze, torn between skepticism and the deep trust that had already grown inside her, and she hesitated only for a breath before drawing her baton and breaking the lock with 2 heavy strikes. The door swung open with a creak, and the beam of her flashlight illuminated a small figure huddled in the corner, eyes wide with terror, his tiny hands clutching at his knees, the missing boy alive but trembling. The rush of relief nearly dropped Clara to her knees, and she called for medics as she carried him out into the night, the parents' cries of gratitude ringing out as they embraced their child, tears mixing with the rain. Officers looked on in disbelief, their flashlights catching the sight of Langston standing a few feet away, his wet clothes plastered to his frame, King wagging his tail as if proud of his discovery, and Clara saw in their eyes the same doubt she had witnessed before, the disbelief that a man like him could be the hero. But she stepped forward without hesitation, her voice carrying firm and clear over the noise. "He found the boy," she said, gesturing toward Langston with a conviction that silenced the murmurs. "He and his dog, don't forget that." The weight of her words pressed on the group, forcing them to confront the truth in front of their eyes, and for once no one dared to argue. Langston shifted awkwardly under the attention, his shoulders hunched as though ready to slip back into the shadows, but Clara reached out and touched his arm lightly, anchoring him in place. Later, after the scene had calmed and the boy had been taken to the hospital for evaluation, Clara found Langston sitting alone on a park bench, King at his feet, the dog's head resting on his knee. She sat beside him, ignoring the mud soaking through her uniform, and looked at him with a mixture of pride and exasperation. "You saved him," she said softly, her voice steady, and Langston shook his head slowly, his lips curling in a bitter half-smile. "The dog knew," he muttered, scratching behind King's ears, but Clara leaned forward, her eyes fierce. "No, you knew. You trusted him when no one else would, and you brought him to me. That's more than most would have done." Langston fell silent, his gaze drifting to the distant glow of the streetlights, and Clara sensed the conflict inside him, the war between believing her words and surrendering to the years of being told he was worthless. She pressed gently, her tone quieter now. "People need you, Langston, not just me. Everyone." The words hung in the night, heavy and undeniable, and she saw the way his jaw tightened, his breath caught, as if the idea of mattering to others was a weight he had forgotten how to carry. King barked once, sharp and approving, as though to punctuate her statement, and Clara felt a strange surge of hope, the sense that something in him had shifted, even if only slightly. As they walked back toward the lot together, the echoes of the parents' gratitude still ringing faintly in the air, Clara realized that this night had done more than save a child's life. It had carved deeper into the bond between her and Langston, proving that his instincts, his courage, and his humanity were undeniable even to those who doubted him. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, that prejudice and pride would continue to build walls, but tonight had shown her that those walls could be cracked, that the man sitting beside her was not just a ghost in the city but a force that could change it, one act of courage at a time. The rescue of the missing child lingered like a crack of light breaking through the walls that had long closed in around Langston Pryor. Yet even after Clara's insistence that he be recognized, he retreated into his usual silence, resisting praise with a quiet stubbornness born of years of being unseen. And though he tried to slip back into the shadows after that night, Clara was determined that he would not disappear again, because she knew the city had just witnessed proof of what she had already learned, that this homeless black man carried instincts, wisdom, and courage the department itself could not ignore. Days after the search, Clara sat across from her captain in his cluttered office, the sound of rain against the windows reminding her of the night everything had begun, and she spoke with a conviction that even surprised herself as she recounted not only the attack in the alley where Langston had saved her, but also the missing boy he and King had found. At first, Captain Dwyer scoffed, leaning back in his chair with skepticism etched across his face, muttering that she was letting sentiment cloud her judgment, that men like Langston were unpredictable liabilities. But Clara pressed harder, refusing to let him dismiss what she had witnessed, laying out each moment with a clarity that made the truth undeniable. And finally the captain sighed, rubbing his temple before agreeing to meet Langston himself. When Clara brought him in, Langston stood awkwardly in the fluorescent light of the precinct, clutching King's leash tightly as though it were the only thing keeping him grounded, and Clara stood firm at his side, introducing him not as a vagrant, but as the man who had saved her life and another's, her voice steady with the weight of her belief in him. The captain studied Langston, his doubt slowly softening into consideration, and then he surprised them both with an offer: part-time work at the station, not as an officer, but as a translator for immigrant communities who often struggled to make their voices heard, a role that could use the fragments of languages Clara had discovered Langston knew during their quiet conversations. Langston's immediate reaction was resistance, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing with suspicion as he muttered that he didn't belong under bright lights and uniforms, that he was fine on the streets. But Clara leaned close, her voice gentle yet unyielding, telling him it wasn't charity, it was purpose, and she saw the way those words pierced through his defenses. After a long silence, he nodded reluctantly, though his shoulders remained tense, and so his first day began with whispers and stares from officers unused to seeing a man like him standing in their halls, his worn jacket replaced by a clean shirt Clara had insisted he take, his scarred hands fumbling with papers as though they burned. The first family he assisted was Haitian, frightened and struggling to explain their case in broken English, and when Langston spoke to them in Creole, their relief was immediate, their gratitude spilling out in rapid words that only he could understand. And Clara watched from across the room as her captain's expression shifted from doubt to grudging respect. Word spread slowly that Langston was useful, that he could bridge gaps no one else could, and though the sneers did not vanish overnight, the weight of his contributions began to tip the scales. King, too, became a fixture at the station, wandering the halls with a wagging tail, officers who once sneered now reaching down to scratch behind his ears, calling him the unofficial mascot, a small piece of warmth in the otherwise cold walls of law enforcement. For Langston, the adjustment was rough, his instincts still screaming at him to run when eyes lingered too long or whispers sharpened behind his back, and there were nights he vanished again, retreating to the safety of the streets where he felt more in control. But each time Clara found him, reminding him quietly that he belonged not because of a uniform, but because of the truth of what he carried inside him. Slowly, he began to believe it. The rhythm of work giving him structure, the gratitude of families giving him validation, and the steady presence of Clara giving him courage to remain when doubt gnawed at him. She watched the transformation unfold piece by piece, noticing how he carried himself differently after helping someone, how his voice grew steadier when he translated, how King wagged his tail proudly each time a frightened child clung to Langston's hand. And she realized that this was more than survival now, it was the beginning of something like redemption. Yet Langston still struggled with the ghosts of his past, the nights when memories of his wife's death and the collapse of his life pressed so hard on his chest that he felt suffocated, and Clara saw the way he sometimes stared at the station wall as though he were waiting to be told to leave, waiting for the world to remind him that he didn't deserve this fragile second chance. But when those moments came, she would stand beside him, whispering words only he could hear, anchoring him to the present until the storm inside passed. The weeks that followed Langston's first hesitant steps into the precinct deepened the strange, unbreakable tether between him and Clara. For every time she passed his desk, she saw the gradual shift in his posture, the way his shoulders straightened, the way his eyes no longer darted to every corner, as though expecting someone to push him back out into the cold, and though whispers and stares still trailed behind him, each family he helped chipped away at the disbelief until even the hardest skeptics had to acknowledge that his presence was more than symbolic, it was necessary. Clara watched with pride, though she kept that pride tucked deep in her chest, letting it glow silently as she observed him bridge gaps that others in uniform could not, his languages unlocking doors that bureaucracy had left sealed, his lived experience giving him a compassion that training manuals could never teach, and each time King padded quietly around the station with his scarred muzzle and gentle eyes, she felt a warmth settle into the sterile air of the precinct, a warmth that came from knowing this man and his dog belonged here even if the world still tried to deny it. Yet she also saw the toll it took on Langston, the constant battle inside him between the fragile trust he was building and the old habits of survival that told him to vanish before anyone could hurt him again, and there were nights when he disappeared for hours, retreating to alleys or bridges where he could breathe without the eyes of the station on him, and each time Clara found him, she never scolded or demanded explanations. She simply sat beside him and reminded him he was not alone anymore. Those nights became their rhythm, a quiet ritual where words gave way to silences that spoke louder, and Clara began to realize with startling clarity that her connection to him was no longer about gratitude or duty. It was about something deeper, something she had not expected when she first stepped out of her cruiser into that storm. She remembered the shame in his eyes when she had cleaned his wounds after the warehouse fight, the flicker of surprise when she had credited him openly for saving the missing child, and the reluctant nod when he accepted the captain's offer of work, and she understood that each of those moments had been bricks laid in a foundation stronger than either of them could have imagined. Langston, for his part, remained wary of labeling the bond forming between them, his pride still heavy with scars, his heart still wrapped in the grief of what he had lost, but he could not deny the way Clara's presence steadied him, how her belief in him silenced the voices of doubt that haunted him each night. He began to talk more when they walked together after shifts, fragments of memories spilling out unbidden, the smell of his wife's cooking, the way their apartment window used to catch the sunrise, the laughter of friends now long gone, and Clara listened with a patience that made him feel human again, her silence carrying more comfort than words ever could. Slowly, she noticed the change in herself too, how she looked forward to those conversations, how the sound of his rasping voice and the sight of King's wagging tail became the highlight of days otherwise filled with bureaucracy and routine, and she knew she was moving into dangerous territory, that her heart was creeping towards something her badge did not cover, but she could not stop it, nor did she want to. One evening, she invited him to join her for coffee at a small diner far from the station, and though he hesitated, suspicious of being seen in a place where people would judge him for his appearance, she insisted, and when he finally sat across from her with King curled at his feet, she saw the disbelief in his eyes as the waitress treated him like any other customer, calling him sir and pouring him steaming coffee without a second glance. That small courtesy struck him harder than any praise, and Clara knew because his hand trembled slightly as he lifted the cup, his eyes glistening in the neon light of the diner sign. They talked for hours that night, not about the precinct or the streets, but about books and music, about the city they both loved and hated, about the what-ifs of life, and when she laughed at one of his rare jokes, the corner of his mouth curved into a smile that she realized she wanted to see again and again. After that night, their connection deepened into something unspoken but undeniable, and though Langston still resisted the idea that he could deserve happiness, Clara's steady presence chipped away at his resistance. He began to look at her differently, not with suspicion but with a cautious tenderness that startled him, and he found himself lingering longer when their conversations ended, reluctant to let her walk away. Clara noticed too, her heart tugging each time their eyes met and held for just a second too long, each time his voice softened when he said her name. The city around them remained unforgiving, its cruelty never pausing, but within the fragile space they had carved together, there was something more than survival, something that felt dangerously like hope. And Clara, sitting beside him under the glow of streetlights with King resting at their feet, realized she was no longer just a police officer who had been saved by a homeless man. She was a woman who had found in him a companion, an equal, someone who carried the same scars of loss but who still had the strength to fight forward. It terrified her, but it also gave her a sense of belonging she had not felt in years, and she knew that whatever storms came next, she would face them not as a lone officer, but as part of an unlikely trio bound together by fate, trust, and something even stronger. The night at the diner stayed with Langston like a quiet ember, one he could not smother no matter how hard he tried. For the simple act of being treated as if he belonged unsettled him in ways the blows of the street never had, and though he returned to his routine at the precinct with Clara close by, a restless weight pressed in his chest, the feeling that something within him had shifted forever. Clara noticed the change in him too, the way his voice no longer trembled when he spoke to families, the way his shoulders squared when he entered the captain's office to deliver a translation, and the way he no longer flinched when other officers looked at him, though suspicion still lingered in their eyes. It was during one of those long weeks that Clara came to him with news of a community gathering, parents and leaders from neighborhoods across the district wanting to meet the man who had helped save the missing child, and though her tone was gentle, Langston heard the insistence beneath her words, the certainty that he needed to be there. His gut reaction was to refuse, shaking his head with the familiar bitterness that clung to him like a second skin, muttering that he wasn't anyone's hero, that he didn't want to stand in front of a room full of people who would stare at his scars and clothes before they heard his words. But Clara leaned forward, her eyes steady, reminding him softly that he had already faced knives, gangs, and storms, and that facing a room of neighbors was just another battle, one that mattered as much as any fight in the rain. After a long silence, Langston agreed, though uneasily, and so the night came when he found himself standing at the edge of a community hall filled with rows of folding chairs, children running between the aisles, parents whispering, officials watching, and at his side, King pressed close, tail wagging nervously as if sensing his master's doubt. Clara touched his arm lightly before stepping back, her presence a steady anchor in the blur of noise, and Langston took a deep breath, stepping onto the small stage where a microphone waited, the light hot on his skin, the eyes of the crowd sharper than any blade he had faced. At first his voice trembled, his words halting, and he spoke of hardship, of nights on the streets when he wondered if he would wake up again, of being invisible, a ghost walking through a city that pretended not to see him, and the room grew still, the whispers fading into silence as his honesty cut deeper than rehearsed speeches ever could. Then he spoke of hope, of how one act of kindness, one moment when someone looked at him not as trash but as a man, had reminded him he still mattered. And as he gestured toward Clara seated in the front row, his voice steadied, rising with conviction. "Don't look at me like I'm some miracle," he said, the microphone carrying his words through the hall. "Look at the people you walk past every day, the ones you ignore, because they matter too. And if you can see them, if you can treat them like they belong, you might save them before they have to save you." The words landed heavy, drawing tears from parents, stillness from officials, and even applause that began tentatively before swelling into thunder. And Langston stood frozen for a moment, stunned by the sound of respect washing over him instead of scorn. Clara's eyes shone with pride, and for the first time in years, Langston allowed himself to feel not just relief but belonging. In the days that followed, his speech spread through the district, replayed on phones, quoted in community meetings, and whispered in precinct hallways, and though he still bristled at attention, he could not deny the way people looked at him differently now, with something approaching respect. Children ran to greet King, tugging at his ears with laughter, parents thanked him with warm meals or firm handshakes, and even officers who had once sneered now nodded in acknowledgement. It unsettled him, this shift from ghost to man seen, but Clara reminded him that being visible was not a burden but a responsibility, one he was strong enough to carry. He began to embrace the role cautiously, mediating disputes between neighbors, guiding young men away from gangs with words they respected more than uniforms, and though his heart still carried scars, he felt for the first time in years that he was building rather than simply surviving. Clara saw the change and felt her own heart swell, realizing that the man who had once leaned against a wall in the rain warning her of danger had become a cornerstone of the community, someone people looked to for guidance, someone she looked to for strength. One evening, as they left another community gathering, Clara walked beside him under the glow of street lamps, King trotting proudly between them, and she whispered, "You see it now, don't you? You see that you're more than what you thought." Langston looked at her, his expression caught between disbelief and gratitude, and for once he didn't argue, simply nodding as the truth settled in his chest. He was no longer invisible, no longer just a man fighting to survive. He had become someone seen, someone valued, and though the weight of that visibility frightened him, it also gave him something he had thought forever lost the chance to hope for a future. The echoes of applause from the community hall lingered in Langston's mind for days afterward, not because he sought glory or wanted the weight of praise, but because the sound itself felt foreign, almost like a language he had long forgotten and was suddenly learning again. And each time he replayed the moment, he wondered how a man who had once been invisible, discarded, and voiceless could now stand on a stage and be heard. Clara noticed the shift immediately, the way his footsteps no longer carried the hesitance of someone ready to retreat, the way his shoulders squared against the world instead of collapsing beneath it, and the way his eyes began to look forward instead of only backward into loss and regret. Yet even with the change, Langston remained humble, often brushing off the growing recognition by crediting King's nose or Clara's persistence. But Clara saw what he could not admit, that he had become a symbol of resilience and hope in a city that had long abandoned men like him. It was not just about the knife in the rain or the child in the shed or the speech that quieted a hall full of doubters. It was about the journey that carried him from ghost to man seen, from survival to purpose, from despair to the fragile beginnings of love. The precinct, too, began to shift, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably, as officers who once sneered at Langston now greeted him with nods, families who once passed him on sidewalks without a glance now stopped to shake his hand, and the captain who once doubted his place now admitted that his station was stronger with him in it. King became a legend in his own right. The dog children adored and officers respected, and Langston often laughed at the thought that his loyal companion had done as much to anchor him to this second chance as Clara herself. But the greatest change of all was personal, unfolding not in public halls or precinct corridors, but in the quiet spaces where Clara and Langston sat side by side, sharing meals, silences, and stories, building something that neither of them had dared to imagine when rain first bound their lives together. Clara saw through the layers of grief and scars to the man who still carried dignity, courage, and wisdom. And Langston saw through the badge and uniform to the woman who had believed in him when belief seemed impossible. Their bond became unspoken, yet undeniable. And one evening, when Clara helped him unlock the door to a modest apartment the department had helped him secure, he stood in the doorway with King sniffing eagerly at the bare floor, and he whispered almost to himself, "Feels like a palace." The walls were empty, the furniture secondhand, but to Langston it was more than a home. It was proof that he had survived long enough to start again. Clara smiled as she placed a small box of kitchen supplies on the counter, watching him take it all in with wide eyes. And when he turned to her, gratitude shone brighter than the lights overhead. "You saved me," he said, his voice low, but Clara shook her head, stepping closer. "No, Langston, you saved yourself. I just reminded you who you are." The words settled between them like truth carved into stone, and in that moment Langston realized that survival had given way to living, and living had opened the door to something more: hope. Months passed, and the city that had once ignored him began to whisper his name with respect, not because he was perfect or flawless, but because he embodied what they themselves longed to believe: that no one was beyond redemption, that every life carried worth, that even the unseen could rise to become essential. Langston did not chase the title of hero, nor did he crave the spotlight, but he carried his new life with quiet strength, choosing each day to keep walking forward, to keep proving to himself and others that dignity could be reclaimed. Clara remained by his side through every step, her presence a constant reminder that trust could be built across lines of race, class, and uniform, and together they and King became an unlikely family in a city too fractured by division, proving that compassion was the strongest bridge of all. On the anniversary of the night in the rain, Langston stood on his apartment balcony, King at his feet and Clara beside him, staring out at the city lights that once mocked him but now seemed to welcome him, and he whispered, "For the first time in years, I actually think about tomorrow." Clara reached for his hand, her eyes glistening as she squeezed it gently, answering not with words but with the steady warmth of her touch. In that moment, Langston understood the true weight of his journey. That survival had led to trust, trust had led to purpose, and purpose had led to love, and that the world, no matter how cruel, could not erase the humanity within him. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer only surviving. He was living, belonging, and building a future with the two souls who had reminded him that heroes sometimes wear rags instead of badges. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'd love to hear what you think about the plot. Was Langston's journey from invisible to seen as powerful for you as it was for me while writing it? Share your thoughts in the comments and let me know where you're watching from. Your perspective adds another layer to the story, and I always look forward to reading your responses.